Fantastic to see so many of you here, either in the house or online. We've got hundreds of people online as well on the live stream. Tonight continues one of the themes we've been running throughout this year here at the RSA, which is asking ourselves the question, what could go right? And discussing indeed what needs doing practically to transform for the better our economy, our society, and the environment. Now, as you all know, business is, of course, a key change agent in our economies, in our societies, in our environments, whether for better or worse. So it's a particular pleasure to be welcoming tonight's guest speaker, who is a leader of one of the world's leading companies, Alan Jope. Alan is CEO of Unilever, one of the world's largest consumer goods companies, serving literally billions of customers every day across pretty much every country on the planet, Alan, I think.
Not three.
All but three. I exaggerated as ever. Alan also holds executive committee roles at the World Economic Forum, International Business Council, and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Unilever has, as many of you know, for well over a century, played a really leading, prominent role when it comes to demonstrating just what it means to be a purposeful business. That is to say, one which whose objectives, whose practices, whose policies stretch well beyond the bottom line to include the E and the S and the G in ESG. And that regenerative approach has also been one of the hallmarks of Alan's time as CEO, as we'll hear more about this evening. It's an approach perfectly aligned, as it turns out, with the RSA's own mission, our so-called Design for Life mission. And as one example of that, our regenerative business inquiry is in the field, currently exploring how we, collective we, can build the capabilities and skills will lead in our future workforce to regenerate the 3 Ps, that is to say people, place and planet. Suffice to say, those sets of capabilities are likely to be very different from those currently being nurtured by our pre-existing set of both educational institutions and indeed businesses. So first we'll go to Alan to say a few words for about 20-25 minutes. Then we'll turn it over to a conversation in the room. So please prepare your questions both in the room and online. We'll get through as many of those as possible and then wrap up at 7 o'clock sharp.
With wine.
With wine if you like. Thank you, Alan. For those joining via the live stream who can't have wine, I guess they can, but in their own houses. You can post your questions in the chat and across social media using the hashtag RSA business. Hope that all makes sense. So without further ado, please join me and welcome to the stage Alan Jope. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andy. Thank you everyone who's joined us today in person or online. Well, I must say it's quite an honour to be asked to make an address in this venerable institution. 260 odd years of history, a commitment to turn world-leading ideas into world-changing action. Those thoughts are weighing quite heavily on me at the moment right now, I have to confess. It's been a busy day. I was at my desk at 5:45 a.m. this morning because today I had the chance to share Unilever's first quarter results with the capital markets and the media. They were rather a good set of results, by the way, so you find me full of good spirit. This was followed by hosting something we do every 2 weeks, which is we have a global town hall in our company and get thousands of people dialing in from all over the world, and they were keen to hear how the company was doing. And I actually had then to shoot out to Surrey to attend the funeral of a very close friend and good colleague, former senior leader in Unilever. And it was a sad occasion, I must admit. So it's good to wrap up the day with an examination of some reasons to be optimistic about the future. But before the optimism, I do want to reflect on a little bit of alarming context. So in our Unilever's view, and in my personal view, the world does face three overarching systemic challenges. And those are the climate emergency, the loss and degradation of nature, and rampant and rising inequality in the world. Of course, there are plenty more acute crises, many of which are related to those big three, but we kind of organize our thinking around what can we do to help on those big three, in a way, existential crises for the world. With that rather bleak context setting, but as a natural optimist, and I am definitely an optimist, I'm very happy to be asked to focus, as Andy has requested, on what might go right in that context. Now, I've had the pleasure of working for Unilever for 38 years. I know you're thinking that that's impossible. How can that possibly be 38 years? Roughly in equal thirds, actually, in Europe, in North America, and in Asia. I've been CEO for the last 4.5 years, and I'll be retiring in 2 short but very busy months. I consider myself to be extremely lucky, very privileged, being in the right place at the right time repeatedly, and enjoyed a very global career in a very global company. In fact, we do call Unilever the world's most global company. We're operating in 193 of the UN's 196 countries. I hope the curious amongst you are saying, right, what are the three? We can come back to that if you like. And 60% of Unilever's sales, so a significant majority, come from outside of Europe and North America. That's very unusual for a global company to have so much of its sales not coming from the big North American and European markets. We're also a real economy company. We've got about 400 consumer brands. Truth is, we don't exactly know how many we've got. Ranging from Dove to Domestos, from Hellmann's to Ben & Jerry's. But we also have a bunch of luxury brands that many people don't know are part of Unilever, brands like Dermalogica, Paula's Choice, Living Proof, Hourglass Cosmetics, the list goes on. They're quite nice. People like when we give those out as presents. As Annie mentioned, collectively Unilever's products are used every day by 3.4 billion people, so about half of humanity use one of our brands each day. We've been around for a long time. The origins of the company as it is today can be traced back to the formation of the Lever Brothers company in 1885. But get this, the oldest artifact that we can find of our company is a land title deed that was granted to what became the Coleman's Mustard Company of Norwich, and it dates back to 1292. So we do have a little bit of history, and in that history is a legacy of responsibility. Our founder, William Lever, we think of William Lever as we've had many founders, but he's the one who's most prominent in our business today and in our thinking. And he looked after his employees with love and with care, providing decent housing. Port Sunlight's a model village in the world. It's a beautiful place where workers in Victorian England enjoyed proper accommodation, where their kids had the opportunity to be well educated, where people were paid, believe it or not, I've seen his handwritten scrawl on a speech at the time of a fair living wage, the idea that people should be paid properly. He was an early participant in pensions, in good working conditions, when these things were very far from common. And of course, along the way, he was creating products like Sunlight Soap and Lifebuoy and so on. Over the last 15 years, this focus on sustainable and responsible business has really been reinvigorated in our company, in part because it's in our DNA, partly in response to the environmental and social pressures around us, but mostly because we think it will make us a more successful and more enduring business. We embrace sustainability not out of charity, but out of enlightened self-interest. And given that the average public company survives for around 20 years, we think some things have gone right for Unilever. And I'll explain in a second what those might be. So to Andy's challenge, what could go right? Well, let me be explicit. What is right? What means things are going right? Well, it's one where we stay within 1.5 degrees of warming, avoiding the worst impacts of the climate emergency that is upon us. It's going right when we halt the destruction of nature. In fact, when we begin to regenerate nature. And it's one where we manage to halt and reverse the polarization in societies and instead bring improved social cohesion. So that's what we would describe as things going right. And business can be and must be at the heart of delivering this positive future. So it's this point of business as a potential force for good that I want to explore just a little bit. So if we have our facts right, in 1877, in this very room, Alexander Graham Bell, Scottish, gave one of the first practical demonstrations of his new invention, the telephone. And look at us now, hopeless phone ad. Actually, I'm quite astonished how few of you are checking your emails or your WhatsApps or your, as we go along. Let's see if that sustains. But I bet everyone in this room's got a phone on them, and possibly two. And I suppose Alexander Graham Bell's genius, and those who followed him, culminating in the genius of Steve Jobs, created a product that was unimaginable 146 years ago. And if we stay in 19th century Britain just for a moment, it was business that drove the Industrial Revolution, created a whole array, a glittering array of innovation. The steam engine, electricity, the internal combustion engine, hopefully coming towards the end of its life, the loom, and critically, production systems that were able to manufacture at scale. Many of these innovations and inventions were created by curious academics, inventors, entrepreneurs, but all of them were brought to scale by business. And this increased productivity and economic output is what allowed society to evolve and improve, we think, transforming people's lives. Public health statistics started to get better. Education became more widespread and not just a privilege of the elite. Leisure time became more plentiful, and we created the opportunity for people to enjoy independent retirement. I'm looking forward to that. And if we look at even more recent times, it is interesting that global poverty reduced every year in the 30 years from 1990 to 2019. Unfortunately, COVID-19 interrupted that trend, but I think it'll return. And a lot of it's been driven by India and China, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty through strong economic development, with business at the heart of that economic development. So we think business can bring paradigm-shifting innovations and can do so at scale, and business can create prosperity for billions of people. But, and it is a very big but, our current model for business, our current model of capitalism will not drive the outcomes that we need for our planet and for society. The uncomfortable reality is that at the same time as global poverty has reduced, 3/4 of the world's population live in countries where over the last 5 years, the Gini coefficient, that gap between the most and least prosperous, has got worse. That's really not a good situation at all. It's also not widely broadcast. So the world is getting richer for sure, but it's not being distributed evenly, and I'm not going to bore or insult you with all the statistics about how rich the top 100 are versus the bottom half of humanity. And furthermore, business has profited by externalizing a range of costs onto society and onto the environment. That means that business has prospered in an environment where there is no price on carbon. There is an inadequate price put on things like carbon emissions, clean air, the use of water, the degradation of agricultural land, and where wages, very often, wages do not reflect the economic value that they have created. So business has been insufficiently incentivized, and this may surprise you to hear, a leader of a big company saying insufficiently regulated to ensure the protection of our natural resources and nor the fair distribution of prosperity. So let me turn the attention a little bit back on Unilever and share some experiences that we've had. But I also want to be modest. Unilever is very, very far from perfect. We are still net carbon emitters. We've not yet succeeded in sourcing all of our agricultural materials in a regenerative fashion. We know that deep in our value chains, people are still working for rewards that don't represent a fair living income or a fair living wage for the work that they're doing. But that doesn't deter us. It doesn't deter us from trying harder. We've long been committed to responsible and sustainable business. It's an instinct we inherited from our founders, and we're learning. We're learning by doing. So today, Unilever operates against a fully integrated business strategy and sustainability strategy. We do not have a separate sustainability strategy. We have one strategy that is for our business and for our sustainability efforts. And we want to deliver a winning performance, but we want to do it by being the global leader on sustainable business. Now, placing humility even further to one side, our efforts have been recognized. So for 12 years running, we've topped the GlobeScan sustainability ranking. That's drawn from the views of 718 sustainability subject matter experts. Most recently, Unilever topped the Responsibility 100 index. It ranks the FTSE 100 companies according to how they're actually delivering against their sustainability commitments. And they concluded that Unilever was doing a not bad job on walking the walk, not just talking the talk. But we're not committed, as I said, to leading on sustainability because it helps in these arbitrary rankings, or even because there's a moral imperative, even though we feel it. We're not an NGO. We do this because we believe there's a very strong business case behind sustainable business, and it's got 4 elements. We believe that sustainability drives growth, it reduces cost, it reduces risk, and it's an absolute magnet for the best and brightest talent. And I'm not going to elaborate those business cases. They're not just plucked out of thin air. There's very hard data behind all of them, and if you want to get into those in the Q&A, we can do. So Unilever, alongside companies that we are proud, even humbled to be put alongside, companies like Patagonia, Natura, IKEA, Ørsted, even Microsoft. We've been pushing hard on this idea of sustainable business, driven by the belief that it will make us a more successful, more durable business. And it seems that more and more businesses are joining that journey, the belief that sustainable business is better business. And why is the snowball gathering? Why are more companies getting involved in sustainable business? Well, there's lots of pressure on companies. First, global frameworks have been set. The Paris Agreement, the COP15 agreement on biodiversity, the Sustainable Development Goals themselves, those frameworks are now well in place. Secondly, the science is that things are getting worse. In 2015, 1.5 degrees was seen as a target. Johan Rockström and his team, he's an amazing guy, Johan Rockström, he invented, and they're exploring this idea of planetary boundaries. And they tell us now 1.5 degrees is not a target, it's a limit. It's the tipping point at which irreversible climate change kicks in, and it's absolutely terrifying. So frameworks, scientific reality, and thirdly, the impacts are extremely visible. Shocking floods in Pakistan from the intersection of heavier than normal monsoon rains and glacial meltwater at abnormal rates, put 2/3 of the country underwater, can you believe it? Multiple record-breaking heat waves across North America, Europe, more recently Africa and Asia, forest fires that are affecting our business every year in the western United States. Our business is disrupted by these forest fires, not to mention people losing their homes and even their lives. Social disharmony, culture wars, populism, isolationism. So all these effects of the wrong side of business are starting to show up. Let me be clear, a world that's on fire or underwater is a lousy place for selling soap or ice cream. It really is. So if that's not enough, this one may surprise you as a fourth factor of change. Investors and the capital markets are putting pressure on us. The stereotype that investors don't care about sustainability is absolutely not my experience. It's not our experience at all. BlackRock, the world's biggest asset manager, engages deeply with us on climate change, often on how we can spur more action from other companies. Legal & General pressed us last year on nutrition standards. Aviva are close collaborators with us on our efforts to drive a living wage economy. Serious businesses are not just developing decarbonisation plans, they're getting shareholder votes to get support for their decarbonisation plans. And then at the more extreme end, progressive activist investors are pushing the laggards. Engine number one's a tiny fund, but it collaborated with the likes of BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard to force a change of board composition at a major oil company to develop a climate strategy. Even governments are acting. You hear the Paris Agreement now being converted into national and transnational law, the UK Climate Change Act, the EU Green Deal, the incorrectly named US Inflation Reduction Act, which is actually a climate change act by another name. And then sixth factor, I know the list is getting a bit long, but I want to give you hope that there's pressure that we're going to go in the right direction. Employees. Our employees are absolutely piling the pressure on us to go harder and go faster. In fact, you can't get good employees these days unless you are committed to doing business the right way. They're picking companies that align with their values, that are mobilizing internally to make sure that their employers walk the walk, don't just talk the talk. You see that particularly on the west coast of the US at the moment. And then the final pressure that I'm going to mention is, of course, the most important one, which is for a consumer goods company, what consumers, also known as citizens, care about really matters. And we are seeing a strong push from the people who buy our products to have sustainable considerations built into the brand choices. You know, the consumer response to David Attenborough's Blue Planet plastic episode, that drove a seismic shift in attitudes towards plastic waste, and it reflects a swathe of consumer data that we have, which tells us that people want businesses to be responsible, to be sustainable, whilst delivering good products at a great price. So all these forces are moving in concert, they're interwoven, they're complementary, but I think they are here to stay, and I can only see that pressure on business to conduct themselves in a more sustainable way increasing, and probably increasing faster than anyone could imagine. We're at the foothills, I believe, of a sustainable economy revolution. Yet there are pressures in the opposite direction, some forces we have to overcome for business to be this unequivocal force for good that it can be. You know, a key feature of becoming a sustainable business often involves internalizing many of the costs that I'd suggested earlier were too externalized: carbon, plastic waste, deforestation, low wages. Businesses in our current economic system are not really incentivized to put a price on those factors of production. Now, in some cases we find we can have our cake and eat it. Eco-efficient factories actually cost a lot less to run. Renewable energy is now cheaper for Unilever to buy than fossil fuel. 100% of the electricity that we use across our factories, our offices, our R&D labs comes from renewable sources, and that's an economically sensible decision. In many instances, paying people a living wage drives prosperity, it drives productivity. So in those spaces, there's absolutely no excuse. Business should be moving as fast as possible because the interests are aligned. But in other areas, it's more difficult. I mean, can you believe what a perversion that recycled plastic costs more than virgin plastic material? That's not right. There's something broken in the system. Deforestation-free palm oil costs more. Chemicals that are sourced from renewable carbon are more expensive than chemicals sourced from fossil fuels. And in those instances, we're letting the market dictate the pace of our transition to a sustainable economy. Short-term returns are being prioritized over science and the future of the planet itself. Is that a smart bet? We don't think it's a very smart bet at all. But individual businesses will get a certain way. The coalition of the willing, the companies I mentioned earlier, will get us part of the way. But we do need a more intelligent operating framework for business. So if I return to the opening question that Andy posed, what could go right? I think it's really more a question of what must go right to avoid some of these existential threats. And what's needed is the right structure of economic incentives and policy interventions that will just keep nudging business in the right direction. So a global tax on carbon is the aspiration. I'm an optimist, I said, but I'm not naive. We know that a global tax on carbon is unlikely given the scale of the vested interests. So we need a more creative solution. And things like the European Union's work on a carbon border adjustment mechanism is a good example. It focuses on where the biggest problems are, and it's quite a workable solution. It's a mechanism that's designed to put a fair price on the carbon emissions of the most carbon intensive goods if they're to enter the European Union. It's a good idea. A UN plastic treaty, believe it or not, is in development, and extended producer responsibility models where you tax on the use of plastic, but put that tax money not into the general treasury, but into collection infrastructure and recycling infrastructure. So you create circularity. There's nothing wrong with plastic. It's a very good material, but it belongs in the economy and not in the environment. And we can make that happen, should we choose. So who wants to build their business on poverty wages deep in your supply chain? Smallholder farmers in Southeast Asia or in Africa should not be living on wages and incomes that fall below the poverty line. We don't. And I think businesses are waking up to the benefits of paying people properly. We know you get increased productivity, you get reduced worker turnover, you get more resilient value chains, and actually you get more prosperous societies that become, I think, self-propelling. Non-financial reporting. We've lived in a world for too long where all that gets looked at by the capital markets is the P&L, the balance sheet, and the cash flow statement. Non-financial reporting is and will become mandatory. Whoever thought that companies' annual accounts would become a focus for activism, but businesses are now being measured on our progress on these so-called non-financial metrics. Actually, as I think about it, they're perfectly financial metrics. Carbon, water, plastic, deforestation, and I hope we can get to common frameworks that allow for comparability across companies, even across sectors. And sustainable business is leading to enhanced valuations. Sustainable business is driving better financial outcomes. So let me try to sum up, and then we can get into a more interesting dialogue and discussion. The world is beset with challenges. Why else would Andy want the RSA to host a lecture series on what could go right? I applaud your desire for some optimism in the world, Andy. We see those three systemic challenges, which, as we see it, many other problems in the world flow. The climate emergency, the destruction of nature, growing inequality. We know the desired outcomes that we want to see. The science tells us, and they're captured in a series of frameworks, treaties, accords, international agreements, and increasingly domestic law. But willing the end is not enough. We also have to will the means. Individual parts of the world, unfortunately, at the moment are retrenching. They're increasingly looking in. We're moving into an era of isolation, more so than collaboration. We don't like that. Nobody seems, can't believe I'm borrowing this phrase, nobody seems to want to make the world great again. But the role of business is becoming central and more central to this debate. None of the challenges that we face, I believe, can be solved without business. As we've said now a couple of times, we serve 3.5 billion people every day. No government has that reach. We know that business has always had the ingenuity, the creativity, the innovative capacity to develop, and importantly, to scale solutions to some of these challenges. And right now, business is applying that ingenuity and inventiveness to today's challenges. There's better alignment of economic, environmental, and social outcomes, but the pace is too slow. It can go much faster with better policy frameworks, better economic incentives. And what is my biggest fear as Unilever CEO? Is it that our quarterly performance falls short of expectations? No, certainly not today. No, my biggest fear is that climate, nature, and inequality problems spiral out of control faster than the world and then business takes serious action. Next week, I'm looking forward to hosting our annual general meeting. We have a chance to engage with our shareholders, and I'm not one for predicting the future, but I am willing to stick my neck out and say that 9 of the 10 questions I will face next week at our AGM will relate to Unilever's sustainability performance and not our financial performance. So watch this space, folks. The parameters for business are being redrawn. The successful businesses of the future will be those that manage to align their commercial interests with making a positive social and environmental impact. And that seems to me to be a reason for some optimism. Thank you for your attention, and maybe now we can get into a bit more of a dialogue. Thanks very much. Come. I've got nothing against the pink chair, but I was told to sit in the green chair.
So usually I get the green chair, you see. I was a bit... Never mind. Listen, Alan, thank you for that. Fantastic, compelling, and candid account of where we are. And let me pick up a couple of questions while everyone else in the room is thinking about theirs. And just start with where we are. I mean, you made the point that that coalition of the willing is forming. It may not be forming fast enough, and it may not be moving fast enough to cope with the challenges. And sometimes when I wake up, and I see in the newspapers, you know, the challenges to ESG in the US in particular, how greenwashing is putting an unfortunate gloss onto the good stuff that is being, you know, not despair, but I think, is this coalition even forming?
Yeah,
much less whether it's, what do you think?
Don't worry, another reason to be optimistic. The so-called woke backlash, it's there, it is there, and actually Jonathan here in the front row has done quite a bit of research on this. And one of the things as a consumer products company you need to be able to do is you need to be able to measure media. And we've gone out and looked at the dialogue that's happening on the online and offline media sources. Yeah. And only 1% of discussion around sustainability is a woke backlash, a criticism. And interestingly, it's concentrated only in 3 countries. So it's in the UK, the US, and Brazil.
Is it really?
So that's where the woke backlash is happening. And it's happening at small scale. The problem is those of us who care about it read exactly the material that's washing back on us. But it's also happening in countries that are deeply politically polarized. And so the solution to the problem is in the solution to the bigger problem, which is if we can find a way of reducing polarization and division in the US, in the UK, in Brazil, then I believe we will discover that this kind of woke backlash is a transitory pressure, and we choose to ignore it anyway.
Very good. That's reassured me. Can I ask you about leadership, Alan? And You've said that this generation of leadership, your generation of leadership, has had to change a lot. The nature of business has changed on your watch, and doubtless what we needed of the next cohort of leaders will be different again, perhaps even more challenging. How do we prepare ourselves, that next generation of leaderships, to step up in the same way you have stepped up with Unilever?
Oh boy, that's a big question, Andy. I mean, I think I can do 4,000 years of leadership theory in 60 seconds. That's my offer. Once upon a time, the belief was that leadership was something you were born into in the era of pharaohs and kings. And then over time, generally militaries concluded that leadership is something that can be taught into people, and so the great military academies of the world were born and taught many great leaders. But over time, I think it's become apparent that the leaders of the future will need this ability to deploy situational leadership, where the nature of the leadership act is dependent on the situation you're in, the desired outcome, and the group that you happen to be privileged to lead. And now coming to the here and now, what I observe is there is a new generation of business leader coming through. Typically, they're characterized by much lower ego than their predecessors. I'll spare them their blushes, but if you look across a lot of the kind of fairly recently appointed CEOs of big American or British companies, they typically are a little bit more humble. And it's rooted in a belief that in the world today, the complexity of the world is such, and the clock speed of the world is such, that no individual can have all the answers. The idea that some CEO is omnipresent and knows all the answers, I can tell you with 100% certainty that would not work at Unilever. And so the leadership of the future is going to be the ability to make sense of a chaotic world and draw on the multiple talents of a team to help make sense and solve those problems. And when you look at the generation of leaders that are being appointed in business, I think they possess that. And Paul, who runs our comms team, is in the back, and he always says, stay away from politics. But if you reflect on where we find ourselves in Britain, I must say the political choices we had 3 years ago frankly were a little bit distressing, and now I think we've got a couple of leaders back kind of ready to duke it out, and so hopefully we'll see a return to some semblance of sanity in political leadership as well as business leadership.
So on politics, sorry Paul, I'd like to explore with you a bit, Alan, the relationship between business and government. So standing aside from the personalities, how we find that happy medium. It doesn't feel like we've found that happy medium, that constructive tension, if you like, between government and business. If it were you, how would you think about how that relationship ought to operate in sort of normal times to generate the growth we need, the dynamism we need, the leadership we need?
Government really matters. Good governance and good government really matters. And I think you've heard me say I believe business matters. I think business can make a very, very positive contribution to the world. And society matters. And the big challenges that we are facing, economic, environmental, social, are beyond the capacity of any one actor to solve. Government can't solve it alone, business can't solve it alone. So as we tackle things like the environmental crisis, we believe that we need government, business, civil society, academia, activists, society itself at the table, expressing their view and helping solve these problems. There has to be collaboration. So, as I said, Unilever is privileged to work in all but 3 countries around the world. And we see very good examples of government collaborating with business to solve problems, and examples where there's a cutoff. And maybe controversially, I'll say I spent 5 years of my career working in China. And the Chinese administrators really understand that collaboration with business can be a powerful accelerator of their policies, including in many instances policies for good. So collaboration, but not just government and business, all sectors of society.
And just on that, and I'll go to the floor. Should we have something that's a definably industrial strategy? Is it the role of government to strategically pick where it wants to place its chips and to lean into that? What's your sense on that, Aaron?
I think you're asking me something you know a lot more about than I do, Andy. But unequivocally, yes. We are craving an industrial policy for the United Kingdom. And actually, I think it's rather obvious. I think there are some industries of the future that Britain is known to excel in. There are some assets that Britain has, our amazing academic institutions. All of that will serve Britain better if it's deployed on a narrower focus of priorities on a multi-year basis, and that's one of the problems. The electoral cycle is a 4-year, 5-year, 3-year cycle. Industrial policy needs to act on a 10, 15, 20-year cycle. You know, I know that I'm a little bit Pollyanna-ish here, but wouldn't it be fantastic if the two main sides of British politics could come together and agree on an industrial policy and set a framework for business for 15 or 20 years? I've spoken to the leader of the Labour Party on what his emerging industrial policy is. I've spoken to the leader of the Conservative Party on what his industrial policy is. They're identical. They're damn near identical. So let's formalise them and say that the life sciences, information technology, great academia, green economy is at the heart of what we want the future Britain to be. Lock it in and we'll be a better country for it.
Here to all of that. Let's go to the audience. Forest of hands, there we go. Let's start, I think you, sir, were first, I think, so we'll go here.
Alan, Andrew Grill, I'm the actual futurist. With all the chat at the moment about AI, we can't pick up a newspaper out hearing about ChatGPT and what Microsoft and Meta are doing. Where do you think AI, and where is Unilever using AI to further your ESG agenda?
Oh boy, I was all ready to answer your question until you added the to further your ESG agenda right at the end there. So, look, there are only a handful of macro forces in the world that you can really rely on to shape your strategy for the future. So we profoundly believe that power in the world is moving south and east. We believe that the bruising of the planet that I talked about is a really kind of secular trend. Demographics don't catch you by surprise. They're highly predictable. So we know where people are going to be. We know how old they're going to be. And the other two big ones are the information technology revolution and the biotechnology revolution. We're in the foothills of both. We're a little bit further up the hill on information technology than on biotech. But I do think, speaking to people who know what they're talking about in this space, we're on the verge of another tipping point in information technology. The convergence of machine learning at scale, artificial intelligence models on big data sets, the advent of quantum computing. This is going to herald a real change. And AI is not something that is going to affect our business in the future. It's affecting our business today. I'll give you 2 or 3 examples. So first of all, when I was a brand manager 30 years ago, you made the kind of your TV commercial once a year and you shipped it out to ITV and then went off to the pub. It was a good life. Nowadays, our poor brand managers are having to create literally thousands of assets for a campaign, for hundreds of media channels with massive tailoring. It may surprise you, a lot of Unilever's advertising is now assembled by artificial intelligence. Of course, the core idea at the moment still comes from a creative team, but the ultimate expression of it is put together by machines and served by machines. And the decision which media will be in is a machine-to-machine decision. So that's using quite advanced AI actually already. What is Unilever's biggest presence in cyberspace, in the cyber world? What is our biggest metaverse presence? It's not some game that Axe has got out there for young boys to use. We have digital twins of all of our factories in the metaverse. where we just go in and we spray those factories with sensors, heat sensors, pressure, temperatures, flow sensors. It creates an enormous amount of data, much more than any human system could deal with. And we're using AI in the cloud to optimize those factories. And we can optimize for cost, we can optimize for quality, and Hugh got an answer to your question, we can optimize for environmental impact. So I'll stop there, but AI, ChatGPT, maybe it's slightly a sad thing. Our colleague whose funeral was today was a senior guy in our finance team, James Allison. And James would have had a twinkle in his eye at the irony that his funeral landed on Unilever's results day, and he would have had a smile on his face that they were good results. And I put into ChatGPT on the train out to Surrey this afternoon, I said, short speech for James's funeral about the irony of his funeral landing on Unilever results day. If I read it out to you now, it would bring a tear to your eye, and it would ring true as if someone who knew James and who knew Unilever had written it. It's quite astonishing.
Fascinating. I'll take one online. There's a couple of questions here, and then go back to the audience, don't worry. 40% of the world's population is under 25. I'm not sure that's true or not, but anyway, let's assume it is. What is Unilever doing, Alan, to engage with Gen Z and future-proof your business, given that?
Yeah. I think it's not a correct fact. I think it might be more than 40%. But anyway, there's a lot of under 25s out there. Well, the first thing is in our, you remember I mentioned that we don't have a business strategy and a sustainability strategy. We just have one strategy. We call it the Compass. And in there is a commitment to make, to create skills and employment opportunities for 10 million young people. So a very explicit commitment. We're systematically working on it. A tiny fraction of that will be jobs in Unilever. But we're very active, for example, with UNICEF through an organization called Generation Unlimited that is trying to connect every young person in the world to the internet, run high quality training materials down that connectivity, teach entrepreneurship, and bring that group of young people together as a group of change makers. Last year, we impacted 90 million young people. Unilever can't take credit for all of that. So we're active in society. We're also active in our own operations. We have an enormous management trainee program. We hire graduates in 54 countries around the world. 8 years ago, we were the employer of choice in 17 of those 54 countries. Last year, it was 52 of the 54 countries. And it's entirely because young people want to join a business that operates to sustainable principles. And I could give some other examples on things that our brands are doing. A brand like Sunsilk, which is a hair care brand, some of you might remember it. It's a gigantic brand across Asia and Latin America. And Sunsilk is helping women find vocational roles through high quality training programs. So in our own operations, with our brands, and through our partnership and advocacy, we are trying to create opportunities for young people. Again, in enlightened self-interest. We want the best and brightest to work for Unilever. Send us your kids.
I'm going to take 2 questions at a time now, so we can squeeze some in. And we're going to start, we'll take 2 on here, and then I'll move across the aisle. So maybe on this row here. The lady next to you as well. Yeah.
Hi, so thanks very much for coming to speak to us. I wanted to touch on something that you mentioned near the end of your speech about the stuff that isn't a win-win. And what kind of economic incentive do you think has to be put in place for us to address those externalities? Because I think the easy wins are if you improve your logistical efficiency, you save fuel, that's great for the environment, and it's also improving your profit margin. But what about the stuff that will hit your profit margin in the short run? And when we say short, it's not 1 to 5 years, it's probably decades, right? It's about, as you say, having a world to sell in 100 years. What would you do to make sure that incentives are aligned to address those non-win-win situations?
Got it.
Terrific. Next.
Hi, I'm Emma from the Wildlife Trusts. So I wondered whether you could say a little bit more about your second systemic challenge of nature's destruction. You mentioned a couple of times deforestation. What about the likes of maybe regenerative agriculture?
Yeah, that would have been my answer. I'll elaborate a little bit on that. Yeah, I'll try to go into more rapid-fire answers in the interest of time. I think on those externalities where there's not a commercial interest to put a price on them, that's where you do need some kind of regulatory intervention. And let's use carbon is the biggest issue. If we could solve one problem right now, it should be the carbon problem. Two things. Standardized reporting of carbon by companies in a mandatory disclosure. It is kind of there in various forms, but that will then, what that will do is it will stimulate the capital markets, and ultimately companies with a lower carbon footprint will have a lower cost of capital, so you create the economic incentive. And the third is the second is some kind of taxation system. So I mentioned the European system, but there are many, a cap and trade system, a flat tax. That's why I was saying you need some kind of government or regulatory intervention where there's no obvious self-interest. Start with carbon and then go to nature. You don't have to solve all the problems in one go. And on that subject, the loss and destruction of nature is primarily driven by agriculture, actually. Wow, I'd love to talk about this a long time. I'd love to get into a debate about palm oil, for example. Is palm oil a good material or is palm oil a bad material? That's an interesting debate. There's a principle, not everyone will be familiar with it, called regenerative agriculture. Our agricultural processes at the moment destroy many things. Deep tilling destroys soil quality. It reduces the quantity of biodiversity. It reduces the soil's ability to hold water. Our current agricultural mechanisms throw enormous amounts of pesticides and nitrate-based fertilizers into the system. It devastates biodiversity, but it's quite easy to reverse that. So you can implement a method of agriculture called regenerative agriculture, where the simple measure is, after you've harvested your crop, is the soil quality, is the water retaining ability, is the biodiversity, and very importantly, are the social conditions around that agriculture better than they used to be. And that does not necessarily have to be at an economic cost. There's a small on cost at the moment, but let's take the example of palm plantation. If you have a sustainably run palm plantation, you won't have water being sprayed all over the place. You'll have drip irrigation using fractions of the amount of water. You will use hardly any fertilizer, and instead of throwing massive quantities of pesticides, you'll erect an owl perch every 10 trees, and the owls will take care of the rodents. And that's what sustainable and regenerative agriculture looks like. It's a better solution. And we're doing it now for soy in North America. You can do regenerative soy at a tiny on cost, quite frankly, in the scale of Unilever. So the loss and destruction of nature will require regenerative agriculture. It will also require advanced technology to catch the bad guys. That's a whole other talk.
There's a couple of questions online, very similar. Personal questions, actually. With a bit of hindsight, is there anything you'd have done differently during your time at Unilever, bearing in mind you've got 2 months still left, Alan?
Well, I've been incredibly privileged and fortunate. I think, when I'm on my deathbed, the thing that will stick in my mind is the privilege that my family and I have had to live and work. Coming from really quite a modest background in Glasgow, the idea of working in London was a dream. Getting to spend time in the United States, 14 years, and then live 4 years in Thailand, 5 years in Shanghai, 4 years in Singapore, before coming back to London, having 3 kids who have benefited and I think become proper world citizens. I wouldn't give up any of that. It's been an incredible privilege. So the macro, would you do it all the same? I would count my blessings 100 times to do the same thing. As CEO, there's 2 things that for sure, 2 massive mistakes I made, which I would do differently. The first is I inherited a profit target, a hard number, a 20% operating margin target for Unilever, and I stuck to it because I thought that we were capable of delivering that. And in the end, it didn't really shape our behavior very much, but it gave everyone the impression that we were more interested in profit than we were in growth, and the reverse was true. So the metrics you talk about send a strong signal about what you're driving. And the second massive mistake was I went out all zealously and gave talks like the one I've done tonight to the capital markets about the importance of sustainability without adequately linking it to total shareholder returns and value creation. And so the short answer is I would be even more intransigent in denying this false choice, this false equivalence, this false trade-off between sustainable business and strong financial performance. And that was a big mistake that I made and would do differently.
Fantastic. Back in the audience, let's take 2 or 3. Let's take 3 at the back there, or perhaps even 4 on this.
Hi, I'm Camellia, and I'm a big advocate of conscious leadership, so it's really great to be here. Thank you. I loved what you said about the future of leadership and how actually it takes not one individual managing chaos and uncertainty and leveraging other people's expertise. I'd love to know how you do that personally, how you manage to keep afloat given how much you're handling at any one time, and what your personal greatest bottleneck is. So like the human aspect of connecting to yourself and then the personal challenges you face. Thank you.
Great question. Along the line there. Who was next on the line? There.
Hello, I'm Tanya from Unlimited, a foundation for social entrepreneurs. I was really interested in what you talked about for non-financial reporting, and if you could just share a little bit more about that. What metrics might you prioritize and why?
Got it.
Super. And then I think there's one here and then one further on the line.
Thanks. Question about failure. I guess I like to think of myself as an aspiring leader of sorts. And in the kind of speed and dynamism and complexity that there is in the world, I have a lot of failures. What have you learned from failure, and how has that shaped your success, and what advice might be able to give to people in my kind of position?
Gosh.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Just one more, just to make it even harder, Alan.
Hi, good afternoon. James Fitzgerald, founder of ecargobikes.com. We provide zero-emission last-mile deliveries for Sainsbury's, Co-op, and this morning signed a 13 million deal with Ocado to continue our work with them. Last year, we spoke with your Olivier
Garel.
Yeah, head of Unilever Ventures. We need 4 million quid. He said, I've got 4 million quid, but my book's out of balance, so I can't give it to you. Love your business, James. Can you help with that? Yes.
I admire your chutzpah. Right, let's see if I can remember roughly the questions. So actually, I think it's a blessing that Unilever is so large and complex, because by definition, it's utterly impossible for one person to kind of pull all the levers. I profoundly believe that each person in my team, one way or another, is much smarter than everyone else in the team. And so when you pull that together, the collective wisdom is much greater than the individual wisdom. And you can do that without surrendering authority. So we kind of wrote a charter for our team, which said we will, the big issues in the company, we will thoroughly debate, we will try to get to consensus, we will make sure all voices are heard, but if we can't get to consensus, Alan will decide. And I can hardly remember a single instance where I've had to come in over the top, because by chewing these things over, I think we can find better solutions as a team than any one individual can. And then for the vast majority of things, let people close to the action, people on the forward edge of battle, people who are close to consumers, close to customers, let them make all the decisions, and only a few difficult ones need to come into the center. And I think COVID helped us on this, actually, because we went from a rhythm of meeting every 2 weeks to meeting every single day as a team. And we were the clock speed of our company went up through COVID. It was horrible in many ways. But that I profoundly believe in the wisdom of the team. Be selective on the issues that you bring to the top table, thrash them through, and be clear that if you can't get to consensus, then someone will decide. And that kind of works okay. Then on non-financial metrics, well, it's a very fraught subject right now because everyone's had this idea, and so everyone's setting their own standards. The European Commission have set an unmanageable forest of 167 different metrics, and a sophisticated company like Unilever, no way could we comply, and any business leader who's not panicking about that simply because they don't understand it. The US are setting up their own metrics, India are setting up their own metrics. My hope is there is a group called the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is a professional standard setting body, and their first standard was a standard for how they're going to set standards. Their second standard is a standard for carbon disclosure, and it very much picks up on something called TCFD, Task Force for something, and Task Force for Carbon Financial Disclosure, I think it's something like that. Climate-related carbon disclosure. Anyway, thank you very much. And so I would begin with carbon, and I would try it. We are fighting very hard to get one body internationally recognized as the core standard setter. It's a very difficult area. It needs professional skills. Let's start with carbon, then we can go on to water and waste and nature and social measures. Failure is a gift. You look to me and sound from your question like a very, very talented individual, and swing for the fences. And if it doesn't work and you make a huge mistake, my experience is you'll probably get promoted. And if not, you'll be able to find another opportunity. And there's a big difference between vascular surgery and selling soap and ice cream. At the end of the day, it's still soap and ice cream. And you sound like you got a kind of a commercial bias. You know, it's just business. And so go for it. I think that's the wrong approach if you're a brain surgeon. And then 4 million quid, yes. So, you know, the capital markets have got lots of different ways of funding businesses, and Unilever was a very, very early company in setting up a venture fund. So we're now on our, actually we're filling now our 4th venture fund, and it's designed to put us in the deal flow of interesting early stage businesses. We can't say yes to everything. There's clear mandates on what we will and will not fund. But if you, alan.jope@unilever.com, ping me a message, still got 2 months to go, and I promise I'll follow up with Olivier.
Very good. I've never seen an audience member's hand go up as quickly as yours, so it's really very impressive. Listen, we're into overtime, but I can't resist asking just one last question of you, Alan. And you said when you were speaking you're optimist, and that's come across so clearly tonight, and that's so important at moments like this, So I wonder if you just leave us with one last note of optimism. What is the thing we all should look towards in our darkest hours as a way forward from here?
It's like it's so clear to me what the answer is to that question. Young people. They're just not going to tolerate the mess that us grown-ups have made. And the drive, the dynamism, the energy, the ideas, the intolerance, the anger of young people is the biggest cause for optimism in the world, I think.
Brilliant. Listen, what a fantastic session that's been, and how lucky we have been to listen to Alan this evening. Thank you everyone online for all your questions, all your comments, and ditto in the room. We got through as many as we could, but I know there was lots more, and maybe Alan can pick up one or two afterwards if he's Happy to stick around.
If there's wine involved.
If you're online in the chat, there's links to All Matters RSA. If you're an RSA fellow, and if you're not, you should be, you can link in to our Circle platform and continue the conversation that Alan's kicked off so brilliantly this evening. After tonight, I hope you will all do that. And finally, last but by no means least, I'm sure you'll wish to join me in thanking Alan for what's been a truly inspiring and uplifting lecture and conversation, Alan, and from all of us to you, to wish you all the best, whatever the future brings. Thanks very much indeed.
Thanks, Andy.